Greetings, everyone. Welcome. I'm a happy camper today because today marks my return to some form of normalcy for this stream. I have been in jury duty for 6 weeks. 6 weeks is a 5+ week trial plus 2 days of jury selection. And it has really upended my world. It's required a lot of my time each week. Probably about 30 hours a week have been tacked on to my responsibilities, and it's been tough. I know jury duty is pretty darn easy to get out of if you don't want. You just tell them what they don't want to hear, and they'll send you home. But I don't like that. I think if you've got legitimate reasons you can't participate in the process, absolutely share them. But if you're a thinking person and feel like you could make a good juror, then I would encourage you to, if you're Americans, or if you have a jury duty system in your country, to step up and make yourself available when it is asked of you. It's a fascinating experience. It's often boring, but it's never not fascinating as a whole. And I have no regrets about my participation in because it was so fascinating. And I'm going to share a lot of thoughts. Some of you may have heard some of them already, but I'm going to try to encapsulate everything in this one video for posterity. So apologies for any repeats for those of you who have heard some of this stuff before, but I'm going to kind of tell the whole story of it here again. So first thing, let's go right to the beginning. It's actually 2 weeks before I got my jury summons. My wife got a jury summons. I kind of laugh, haha, you got a jury summons. She's like, oh. 2 weeks later, I get my jury summons. Same court system. So she laughs back at me. We both do our processing, and even though our summons came 2 weeks apart, we both ended up getting seated on a jury for the same court system starting on the same Monday. So married couple arbitrarily gets jury duty starting on the same day at the same court. Crazy, except for because of COVID, half the cases in said court had been moved to an empty convention center on the east side, way far away from the actual courthouse. And of course, my case on the east side courthouse, temporary courthouse, my wife's case in the main courthouse in Seattle. So we could not even commute to this to our identical jury duty together because we were actually going to two separate places. So that's kind of funny thing number one about the whole affair is that I had simultaneous jury duty. My wife's case was rough. It was a 2-week criminal case that involved sexual assault and was pretty hard for her to. It was a tough couple of weeks for her. One thing I want to note right away is that jury duty selection process, previously what they do is get about 200 candidates to come down to the courts and spend 2 days figuring out if they were going to get placed on a jury somewhere. Due to COVID, they switched it to Zoom-based jury selection. So instead of 200 people at the Seattle courthouse, you got 200 people-ish on Zoom going through the process there, and it was really effective. And instead of 2 days hanging out at a courthouse wondering if, I spent 2 hours doing a jury process and then just waited to hear about it. And our judge says that might be the process going forward. She's certainly in favor of it, and I am too. That was hopefully there's a lot of things we're learning about the world and how we can do it better using technology and remote technology, thanks to the pandemic kind of forcing our hand on it. And hopefully this is one of those silver linings where something as important as our court systems find an incredible time savings for the system through the act of managing through a pandemic. So hopefully that's a plus there. Anyway, I make it onto this case, and I'm nervous because when the first thing they have to do is make sure you don't know anybody involved in this case, right? So they send you a list of people. Do you know any of these names? Friends, this list was longer than my final college paper, I think. I mean, it was just there were so many names on this list. I was instantly intimidated just by wow, that's a lot of people that I'm supposed to not know. Now, I didn't know any of them, but it turned out it was prescient because the reason there were so many people is it ended up being this 5+ week trial with what was our final witness count? Somebody in our jury had a final witness count, but I think it was in the 50s. I think we had 50. It depends on whether you count them. I don't know, dozens. Certainly, it is safe to say dozens of witnesses. And what was the case? Okay, so the case was, I can even, if I have the final court instructional documents, I was allowed to take this home because this is part of court record, no big deal. But this was the Stephen Roland Lynch versus City of Seattle. Stephen Lynch, I'll call him Steve because that's how it kind of went by in court. Steve Lynch is a former Seattle firefighter who was injured on December 15th, 2016, while fighting a fire at the Woodland Park Zoo in Seattle. The building that caught fire was the Nocturnal House, although kind of the former, that's what it was called, but is actually abandoned. There's a day house and a nocturnal house side by side. The day house was in use. The nocturnal, they're like connected, and the nocturnal house is where the fire was. They evacuated animals and stuff as a part of the process. But I want to say, like, the building that was on fire was not officially in use, and that's actually a relevant point that kept coming up in the trial. But basically, I'll lay out what happened for you. So the Seattle Fire Department, there's a call from the zoo saying there is a fire. They think it's electrical in nature. The caller says, we've got an electrical fire at the Woodland Park Zoo. And the 911 call didn't have a lot of, it was, class people are just responding in a tough situation. They have sketchy info. They call the fire department, they arrive. Sure enough, there's plumes of smoke coming out of this building. So the fire department, I learned a lot about fighting fires. The default approach to fighting a fire in this situation is what's called an offensive approach, which means you attack the seed. They say the seed is where the fire started, right? The core of the fire. So, and there's always what's called an IC, an incident commander. So one of the lieutenants in the fire department who's on the scene becomes the incident commander, who's kind of the one directing how this is going to go down. And so the incident commander on the scene sends in initially a crew of a couple of firefighters with hoses to go put water on the seed of this situation. It's heavy smoke, not great visibility, but they go in. And also worth noting, it's a windowless concrete building, so there's not like they can't. There's nowhere for the heat and the stuff to go. So it's getting really hot and really smoky in there because there's no windows to open and nowhere for the problem elements to escape. And so they send in to put fire on the seed, and then Stephen Lynch is sent in afterwards. Well, they had to back out. I want to get my sequencing right, but basically, the fire was intense enough that the initial crew that went in there had to back out. It was too hot. So this is where I learned really cool stuff about firefighting. But so what you do in that case is you have to actually ventilate the roof, because what's happening is the hot gases are rising to the top of the building, of the room, and they're gathering there. And as things get hotter and hotter, those gases at the roof can ignite. That's called a flashover. And if you're a firefighter in the room when a flashover occurs, you're in serious trouble. You're probably dead. You need to get in there, and so in order to prevent flashover, you need to cut a hole in the roof, because if you cut a hole in the roof, all of that gas that's about to flash over exits the roof, exits the building, and everything cools down. The visibility goes up because the smoke goes out. The heat goes down because the heat goes out. And that's one of the main ways you make a fire fightable from the inside, is ventilating the roof so that the fire isn't as hot. Although here's the thing, you have to put water on the seed first. You can't ventilate the roof as the first thing, because if it's not wet in there, if you haven't gotten water everywhere, then much like a bellows or a campfire, like that adding of oxygen is going to feed that fire and make it grow. So the process of fighting this, of dealing with the situation, is put water on the seed, ventilate the roof, and then everything becomes more fightable. And so Stephen Lynch, the first crew has retreated due to the heat, and now it is Stephen Lynch, our plaintiff's job, to do what's called cooling the overhead. Because they need some time to get the roof ventilated, Steve's job is to prevent that flashover from happening by getting an appropriate distance from where the fire's at hottest and everything, and getting to a spot where he's like kneeling on the ground with his hose and nozzle, and you're kind of actually just aiming and you're firing water at the ceiling so that you cool the overhead, so that by keeping that area at least cool, you keep the gases from igniting and causing a flashover. So Steve's doing his job of preventing a flashover via cooling the overhead while the other crew is ventilating the roof. This is where the crux of he's also got, there's a lieutenant in the room with him too. So there's one other firefighter backing Stephen Lynch up. And then at that point in time, this is where we only have 2 live witnesses, 2 people in the room. But what happens is Steve Lynch suffers an injury. Exactly how he suffered the injury is part of the question that we had to answer as a jury. But Steve Lynch claims that what happened was so he was about a few feet away from a set of electrical panels. They were in a corridor. So like, I wish I could show you the map, but like imagine Steve Lynch in a corridor in a building, and off the corridor there's a room, and the room is where the seed is, and so he's kind of in the corridor firing the hose into that room, and in that corridor there's some electrical panels on the wall, and Steve says that he saw a glow, like one of the electrical panels glowed, and then zap, there was an arc blast came off of the electrical panel, hit him, knocked him back 8 to 15 feet, depending on who you ask and who, and that he fell into, what does Steve claim? That he fell into, that he landed on his side, that he basically got launched in the air, but then landed on his side and like injured himself, that he got electrocuted and physically injured by getting knocked back like that. So he then leaves but like, firefighters are a lot like football players. If something happens to you, you don't necessarily quit. You get back in the game. And so he's kind of like a macho firefighter guy, and says that despite being hit by this dramatic event, he was compelled to keep working. And also, if you have if you're concussed, you're not a good judge of yourself anyway, right? So the other thing is, he continued to fight the blaze after this happened. He says he called over the radio, "Cut the effing power!" And this is the key. So he claims that at this point, he radios, "Cut the effing power" to the building, because one of the things, there's a lot of things to keep in mind at a fire scene. When you're doing a fire response, there's a lot of factors to consider. And one of the factors to consider is securing the utilities. This is a term that came up a lot in this trial. Securing the utilities means, well, cutting the power to the building so that things like arc blasts or electrical shocks are mitigated. They don't happen. It's not as simple as just always cut the power, though, because what if the power is functioning? What if the power is keeping some animals alive? It's you don't know what the power is doing for you. So there is also, it's a thing to consider. And of course, it makes it more safe from the electrocution front, but there are reasons to consider not doing that too, of course. But the plaintiff says that this happened to him, and then basically, I don't want to get too far into the weeds of the aftermath, other than right now, at least, other than to say that the exact nature and level of his injuries and the exact thing that happened in that moment was a big question and a big debate, and a lot of evidence and a lot of stuff was put out. I mean, just tons and tons of evidence on the plausibility of his exact story there, and exactly how injured he was after the fact. But before we even get to that stuff, fundamentally, the question one, and in fact, I think it's even, I could probably find it in here somewhere, but like at the end of the day, as the jury, we had to answer 3 questions, okay? The questions were, 1, was the city of Seattle negligent? Fire department being part of the city of Seattle. If no, we're done. Case, fine for the defendant, case done. If yes, question number 2 is, did the negligence lead to firefighter Stephen Lynch's injuries? Did the injuries he sustained, were they caused by the negligence itself? If yes, part 3, how much is Stephen Lynch's life worth? This is where you get into the economics of a human being. Not that he's dead, but that basically he had to eventually stop firefighting. He's no longer part of the force. He went on leave, tried to come back several times, had different reasons for not being able to stay back on the job, between physical injuries, PTSD. Basically, between the time of the end of that fire and the end of his firefighting career, he tried multiple times to come back to the job. Because I'm going to keep, like, that firefighter NFL player, I think, is a really good analogy, because in the same way that playing in the NFL, despite being hyper dangerous, is this thing that only a handful of people get to do. It's very competitive. Everybody wants to do it. And, if you want to play in the NFL, you got a lot of competition, right? If you want to fight fires, you got a lot of competition. It is a tough job to get, despite its dangers. And much like the NFL has a bunch of macho humans that are strong and tough and like to show that they're strong and tough. And a lot of their identity is wrapped up in being strong and tough, right? I've talked about how our own identities can really affect how we behave in the world, because we want to protect our identities. Steve Lynch wants to protect his image for himself and with his compatriots as, I'm a strong, tough guy. So it can be hard to know exactly how injured you are in the moment. And but a lot of stuff played out after that. But fundamentally, question number 1 was the first order of business, and that is, was the city negligent? Now, it was worded very broadly. So I treated it, and I think most of my fellow jurors treated the prime negligence to be how the fire was fought. Because the plaintiff's attorneys, their expert witness, their whole thing was, electricity should have been cut as a top priority. That they waited way too long to cut electricity, and because of failing to cut the power sooner, Stephen Lynch experienced this arc blast that ended his firefighting career. That's effectively the plaintiff's case. A mistake in firefighting by the incident commander led unnecessarily to Stephen Lynch suffering an injury. And so here is now taken aside and say, like, speaking of the NFL, one of the analogies I've given for what this process was like was that it is like an NFL game. The court process is like an NFL game. How do I get there? Because, all right, an NFL broadcast, if you take the pregame and the postgame show, an NFL broadcast is like 5 hours of time, right? But of that 5 hours, well, 2 of it is pre and post. Then you got 3 hours of game time in which there's a clock in use. But of that 3 hours of game time, there's only 1 hour of actual clock running time, right? And of that 1 hour of clock running time, only 11 minutes of it is snap to whistle football. If you edited out an NFL game down to just the ball snapping and then the whistle being heard, you'd get about 11 minutes of action. And then of those 11 minutes of action, under a minute represents plays that are so significant that they actually change the outcome of the contest. And that's my analogy for what this game of litigation is like. It is so, there's so much waiting and so much process and so much line towing and so much extra info that it is just so heavy with stuff that just kind of doesn't matter quite as much. And so that was the toughest part. The toughest part was getting through the downtimes and getting the repetitive information through, because that's kind of the, like I said. And so I brought up that analogy, though, because to go back to where we are in the fire, this is the crux for me. The crux of the whole case really came down right at the top, right at the top of the things we're trying to decide. If the Seattle Fire Department was supposed to cut the power early, then I was like, okay, well, you got to convince me then, plaintiffs, what should have been done instead? How should it have gone down? And that is the thing that nobody was ever able to answer. Not the plaintiff's expert witness, and not the defendant himself, who kind of deferred to the expert witness. The expert witness said they only got around to calling. So the way here's the thing, though, to secure utilities and to cut power to a building, again, you can't just go willy-nilly in and do that. A firefighter can't go and mess with electrical panels they don't know about. They need to have an expert, whether that is someone, if it's a commercial space, if someone who knows the building, or a representative from Seattle City Light, the city's power company. So it is quite common at some point to call Seattle City Light to have them come in and identify how to safely go about cutting the power. So the plaintiff's attorney's point was they did not even call City Light until like 15 minutes after they should have. If they called it like 15, 20 minutes into the fire response, and the plaintiff's argument is that that was negligent. They should have called City Light right away and gotten someone headed over there right away. But here's where their case broke down for me. Because, again, I learned a lot about firefighting. If we go back to the scene I described in this building and the ventilation of the roof that was required to make the fire safer to fight on the inside, keep in mind, the first team that went in had to leave because the conditions were so bad. They went in with hoses, like they were armed with hoses, and they had to leave. So here's the thing with securing utilities. If you secure utilities first, before anything else, that means you're saying, wait, don't fight the fire. Take one firefighter, and let's say City Light is right there, and they say they got there. They called him early, and City Light is on the scene telling him exactly where to go. They would say, okay, you need to go into this room, over here, this panel, shut it down. That's how you cut the power. Okay, well, what do you do with that information? What's going on? It's a room full of smoke. It's not safe. You can't even go there with hoses. So you would never send in someone without a hose to go cut power in a smoke down to the floor situation where you're just feeling around like you can't. So my whole issue with the plaintiff's major part of their case was that they were saying they should have cut the power right away, but they never offered a reasonable, safe sequencing on how to approach the fire otherwise. There's only two things they suggested. The other thing that was brought up, remember how I said that it was empty, that it was vacant? The vacancy is relevant because every fire is different, and the firefighting mantra of how to approach risk assessment in fire containment is risk a lot for a lot and risk a little for a little. So, for example, human life is a lot. If there's human life at risk, then firefighters are going to be willing to risk their lives. They're going to put themselves at risk. So another point from the plaintiffs was they shouldn't have even attacked the seed. This should not have been fought offensively, because another way to fight a fire is defensively. Instead of going in and trying to stop the fire, if you fight a fire defensively, you are instead staying back outside and you are containing it. So one of the scenarios that the plaintiffs effectively offered was that it should not have been fought offensively. They could have fought this fire defensively, since it was an abandoned building. There was no human life to be lost in there, and that just doesn't hold true for me either. I don't think any of us, that just wouldn't be acceptable. I mean, this was first there were animals in there. Now, animals are not humans. You don't get to, even exotic zoo animals are property. And there's a difference between property and humans in terms of that risk assessment, right? Of course. So but imagine the press, imagine how Seattle reacts if they find out that there was a fire at the zoo in a building with animals in it, and the fire department's decision was to stay back and let it burn. And not only is that risky with regards to just the animals and stuff and all that, but it's a beloved location. Seattle loves the zoo. And also you introduce new risk. If you're going to let this thing burn, well, then the fire can spread. You might not. Well, yeah, preserving human lives should trump that. Rescoto. So Rescoto may be of the opinion that apparently if there's nobody inside a building, fire departments should just let the buildings burn down. I mean, you could have that stance, but that's not realistic. That's not what people want out of their fire department. As much as we value our property, our lives well above our property, the property matters too. And there's an expectation that what the fire departments are doing is trying to save life and property. But of course, it's a scale. How much risk is there? But this wasn't they were taking appropriate risk. Oh no, the building wasn't. I should clarify what Mike said. The building was not actively exhibiting animals, but there were hibernating animals in the basement in storage, basically. I don't know how it all works out, but there were animals. So you've got the day house and the night house connected. The day house had actual animals and was connected to the night house. The night house had actual animals in the basement. But no fire suppression system in the building, no, and that's another reason to not cut the electricity. Mama brings up no fire suppression systems often need electricity to work, so you don't go willy-nilly cutting power until you understand what you are cutting besides, what else you're cutting besides the power to these electrical panels. Another thing, electrical injuries are exceedingly rare. They are not a common thing that happens in a fire response. So another thing you're saying, if you want to just let the building burn down because a firefighter might get electrocuted because we haven't secured the power yet. Again, it's hard for me to explain it here super coherently, but it's there's just such a preponderance of evidence for me that nothing about cutting the power first made any kind of sense. In fact, here's what I eventually, to cut to the end of the story, we did end up getting to chat with the attorneys and even the plaintiff about how this went down. But in explaining where I was coming from, I was saying that I just didn't. Fluffy says I don't know. Let's not get too deep into the fire system. The point is, maybe the suppression systems don't use electricity. The broader comment, though, holds true that cutting power inherently has some risk until you know exactly what is being affected by the lack of power. That's really what I'm saying. So don't get too hung up on that. But the point, now I've lost my train. But where was I? So we had talking to about like it didn't make any sense to me. Oh yeah, here's where I'm getting to. In order to cut power, you needed to go into the building. You couldn't. There's no magic button to press to cut power from remotely from Seattle City Light, unless you're like, unless you're like, oh, where was I going with that? So anyway, you can't, you would never cut power from like a transformer or like, because if you're not cutting power locally in the building, if you're broadening it out, you're just cutting power to more stuff. Like you can't cut it from the light pole or whatever. You gotta, clearly the system for cutting power is get information from the experts and then go in and do it. But it is not possible to go into that building and cut that power until you have done the roof ventilation. So kind of the way I put it was the plaintiff's argument was that they should have secured the utilities first. And I said, but Stephen Lynch in effect was securing utilities because cooling the overhead so they could ventilate the roof and clear the room is what needed to happen so that the utilities could be secured. So I don't know how you can say that they're negligent for not securing the utilities first when the very act that the firefighter was engaged in when he was injured was moving towards the goal of getting the utilities into a place where they could be secured safely. So really the only possibilities to me were exactly what they did, or fight it defensively and let the thing burn. And neither of those is realistic. It was quite clear to me that the fire department was not negligible in how they fought this fire. It's broader than that, though. The question on the thing is not, was the city of Seattle negligent in the way they approached fighting the 1215 zoo fire? That's not the question. The question is simply, is the city negligent? And that's where you can go a little, someone was talking about, well, they should have had, well, you get to the zoo. Should the zoo have had something there? Should so for example, here, someone who, also spoilers, we were not a unanimous jury. So there are definitely people who had different opinions in our jury. And the strongest opinion for negligence by the city came from a juror who put a lot of weight on lack of documented training. When I say documented training, there's obviously tons of training that goes into firefighting, but this juror felt that there needs to be proof of training. There should be certification. There should be, however you want to put it. She felt like the training level stuff was so lacking that represented the city being negligent. And I mean, you can come from that perspective. I pushed back on that a little bit. I pushed back on that a little bit because the definition of this is what you end up having to do is reading all this stuff here. Like as we're debating all of these things, you need to do things like this. Let's see. I want to find it. Oh man, there's a lot of words in here. Here we go. This is what I was looking for. So like you gotta face things like, what does negligence mean? So here's our instructions. Negligence is the failure to exercise ordinary care. It is the doing of some act that a reasonably careful person would not do under the same or similar circumstances, or the failure to do some act that a reasonably careful person would have done under the same or similar circumstances. Now, I cannot make it to, like, listening to that definition of what negligence we're looking for, you cannot convince me that a failure to have a perfectly itemized or processed training regimen is a failure of ordinary care. That is not a failure of ordinary care. And not shutting the utilities off was not a failure of ordinary care. And I would certainly say this, even if you felt like, you know what, they should have just let that thing burn. Don't risk any firefighters. Don't risk anything. Just contain, contain, contain. Even though as a society, I promise you, we would never accept that from our fire departments. If you found that to be a viable choice, it's awfully tough to suggest that it was negligent not to choose that choice. At the very minimum, you have to say that the approach that was taken was a legitimate option, and that defensive fire was I don't think you could get to defensive was clearly the only option. That's just not true. I think if you look at and common care, like cutting the power right away was not common. Like that just wasn't a common thing. Most of the sequencing happens exactly as I was talking about. The number one risk to firefighters is the fire growing. If the fire grows to be bigger than what the current resources to handle it are, that's when firefighters get hurt. So like to suggest that the best way to keep firefighters safe is to switch to some new thing where we let buildings burn down until the electricity gets cut off, well, then we're just going to be letting buildings burn down. That's not and if you certainly that if you think that should be considered, I don't think you can say that the negligence was that it was not negligent to approach the fire the way they did. At most, you could say there were some things they could have done differently, but none of it fell to the range of negligent. Much like, is it a punt? We're here on stream, right? Like they didn't punt. You can't punt that one. You could say that you would have taken a different line, but it is not objectively a punt. It's just a different line that you could make an argument for at most. So that's the crux of the negligence part. But then, so why did the trial take so long? First, there was 1 million witnesses to all of this. But then also, here's what bums me out, is that the lawyers are presenting all of their cases all at once. And, not all at once. Yeah, they're just all talking at the same time. The point is, I phrased that terribly. Let me refactor that sentence. The attorneys need to argue everything they're going to argue about the case in the context of the one trial. You're packing it all in, and also there's very little communication between juror and courtroom, so they have to just present it all. So they're showing it, and also because they need to present all parts of it. So they need to assume that we're going to find negligence. And if we find negligence, what's next? Well, if we find negligence, the next thing is, were the injuries caused by the negligence? So this is where things got heated and murky and weird, and who is lying and whose expert witnesses are fudging, and this is where as a juror, you just everybody's gaming here. There's obviously gaming going on here, and people are lying and misrepresenting to try and make me think the way they want me to, right? And that's because at this point you get into what exactly happened there. Did Steve get hit by an bolt of arc lightning, fly back 15 feet, land on his side, and injure himself heavily? Well, the city, of course, the plaintiffs are on the extreme end. He went 15 feet, and everything that happened to him happened on this day, and it was all because of that, right? Whereas you go to the city side, the city's there was no electrocution at all. The only thing that happened to Steve Lynch is that he fell down while fighting the fire and hit himself on the head. And they basically said, we'll grant you that it looks like he had a concussion. Maybe he was concussed, but there is no evidence There is no objective evidence of any injuries caused by that fire to Steve Lynch besides potentially maybe a concussion. And there was plenty. And again, the medical testimony is a heavy part of this. But here's where, so you say a doctor looked over him. I feel that would be strong evidence. Oh, believe me, lots of doctors. At the time, he was insisting he was fine. He got looked over by, in fact, he had to be coerced into, he was saying, I don't even need to be looked over. And in fact, he didn't even get looked over until he went back in. I mean, he kept fighting the fire. But again, all this is just exactly the same as an NFL player continuing to play with a concussion, right? It's just something that people do because they're not good at assessing their own health in a potential concussion situation. So the accident, so there were, so was he shocked? Well, I don't know how deep you want me to get into the evidence and stuff, but I'll throw out some factors here. The witness behind him doesn't say he saw that, but the witness behind him is a firefighter being part of the red wall, right? Red wall of silence, right? So you had to somewhat mistrust the firefighters testifying against Stephen Lynch because they were all trying to CYA as well. A lot of CYA happening here, right? So factors about the electrocution for and against. Against, the panel that we're talking about is a 120/240. It's not a high voltage. The defense had a witness who said scientifically the arc that Stephen Lynch described was literally not possible from that level of voltage in that panel. That a panel of that voltage can arc approximately 3 millimeters, but not really anything more than that. You could say, oh, well, he was firing a hose with water. So it wasn't that it arced, it was that it went through the water, right? Except the way that firefighter hoses work is that they're intentionally, they intersperse it with air so that there isn't a continuous stream from the end of your hose water back to the hose. There's air in between so that that electricity cannot pass through the kind of vapory hose of a firefighter's hose. So there's that. There's but here, so for it, I'll give you another against. There was no evidence that there was no marks on his clothing or his body indicative of electrical damage, like that he got burned by electricity. There were no electrical burns on his clothing or his body that anybody found at any point, and that was not disputed. However, it's really interesting to see evidence about what people remember when there's kind of two kinds of evidence for me when it comes to what people are saying. There's the evidence of what people thought and said in the moment, in like the 2 weeks after the incident. That's where everybody involved is just doing their jobs. Nobody's thinking about a lawsuit at that point. Everybody there is just trying to make sure Steve is healthy, that everybody's okay, that the team is good. And nobody's, I just don't think people are CYA lying about things happening on the scene in that moment. So for me, the contemporaneous stuff, the stuff that happened in that moment or in the weeks after, is the hugely most important memories for me in terms of identifying what actually happened there. So the two things that stuck with me, pulling in both directions, are one, the testimony from the firefighter behind Stephen Lynch, who denies that there was any arc blast. He said he saw a little blue, he saw one light or something, he said, but again, mainly, this was a man who, again, at that moment, was standing behind and supporting a colleague fighting a fire, watching this whole thing. If the dramatic arc lightning that Steve Lynch described happened exactly the way he described it, down to the letter, like exactly the way he described it, I do not believe that guy behind him wouldn't have said something. There's nothing on the record about him saying anything. I mean, there's stuff on the record about Steve falling and but there's nothing on the record about this guy going, holy hell, did you see that? Right? Because the thing that Steve Lynch described is definitely a holy hell, did you see that moment? There's no way you would see that and not go, and there was nothing in the records of the guy, Chris Carter, the guy behind him, having seen anything like that. Chris Carter does acknowledge that he fell. In fact, he says he fell into him. They bumped into him. But there's a huge dispute. Lynch says he got blown back, fell on his side, contorted in the air, and made sure he landed well. And his compatriot behind him says, no, he fell back into me, and then we kept doing our thing. And so that's huge for me to at least suggest that Steve's story as he told it in court was maybe exaggerated. I'm not saying he lied, because here's the other thing. I want to say this about Steve Lynch right now. I do not believe for a second that this is a firefighter who was like, you know what? I'm kind of done with this firefighting game. I think what I'm going to do is make up a story and try to get the government to just pay me and call that good. No, this is a guy who really wanted to get back to firefighting. So I never once felt like this was a total some grift. It was not a grift. I do believe Steve Lynch was injured that day, but I am not convinced he was injured to the extent that he expressed in his story about it. But I also, I've kind of saved this because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there wasn't an electrical component to his injury. But even one of the defense witnesses, one of the firefighters, acknowledged that Steve came out and told him, man, I got zapped, right? So like there is anecdotal memory evidence on that day of Steve telling people around him that he got zapped, that he had an interaction with electricity. And that makes me think he absolutely did. So again, I put a lot of stake into these at the moment discussions that people had, even though there can be spotty memory there as well, for sure. I just felt like those pieces of information, the lack of a response from Chris Carter and the definite evidence of Lynch telling people that day that he got zapped, is an evidence that, I do think he interacted with electricity that day on some level, but I don't think it was to the extreme levels that he described. And the thing is, you have to understand, we're now getting into the area that is effectively moot. So I'm sitting here talking to you about this stuff, but none of this matters if the city isn't negligible. If the city isn't negligible, no matter how hurt Steve got, it becomes just part of the job of firefighting, and the sucky part of the job of firefighting, that it hurts you a lot, But acknowledging that Steve got hurt and then it sucked is not the same thing as negligence. But this is why the whole process was so difficult for me. Very early on, probably within 6 or 7 days of the start of the trial, basically whenever the mega witness for the plaintiffs, there was a retired fire chief. Oh my God. Okay. If you know this because you heard me say it before, don't guess. But for you live folks, this was the winner. There were a bunch of expert witnesses. Okay. And one of the things about civil trials and expert witnesses that I've learned is that every expert witness is going to have to say how much they got paid to do their thing, because the other side wants to make sure the jury understands that this is a paid opinion. They're always going to make sure you understand that this is a paid opinion, and they're going to tell you exactly how much the opinion was paid for. So the mega witness, the big witness for the plaintiffs, was a retired police, sorry, not police, there's no police involved, a retired firefighting chief who now does this kind of thing, who's an expert witness in his retirement of sorts. And he was the most paid. He didn't get the highest rate, but rate times time, he was paid the highest amount of any of the paid witnesses in the trial. I want you to guess how much he was paid for his testimony in this trial. You guess that. And anyway, while you guess, I'm going to explain to you that This was the witness who, the best he could offer me was they should have called City Light earlier. And now that was a moment where at that point in the trial, I could have written a note to the attorneys involved and said, hey, juror number 6 here, I just want you plaintiffs to know your case is sunk. Your case is sunk with me until you come up with a different way that fire could have been plausibly fought. You did not provide that to me. Therefore, as of right now, here, 7-ish days into this trial, your case is sunk. I'm already for the defense because you have failed to show me what should have been done otherwise. Nothing on that front was compelling. But of course, we're not allowed to communicate that. And so the lawyers need to presume that we're all still on the fence and we all need to be convinced. So of course the trial marches forward. Got a lot of guesses in here, so I'm going to give you the answer. Ooh, some good ones. Siriana's pretty close. It was our big winner. This fire chief was paid a little bit north of $80,000 for his complete testimony. And I think the sum total of all paid testimony was probably in the, I want to say the $350,000 range. So certainly over 300, I think under 400. So somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 were spent on expert testimony alone on this trial, just to pay some of the witnesses. That's it. Forget the lawyers in the courtroom. Oh my gosh. So anyway, the process became very difficult for me when 7 days in, I was already on defense, ruling for the defense, but I don't get to just be done. I now get to spend the next 4.5 weeks listening to both sides present arguments in case we find negligence. So that's where there was a lot of stuff around. And to get back to Stephen Lynch and his injuries, like a big part of the case for the plaintiffs was, look, he got checked out by all these doctors after the fact. He has all this injuries, all this stuff going on. Clearly, this fire and that accident at the fire injured him. But this is where, boy, you get to see how the lawyers on both sides kind of are very choosy about what things they show to their experts to get what they want out of it. So one of the, again, if you remember question number 2, did the negligence cause these injuries? And the plaintiffs, to make the point that they caused the injuries, hired, Lynch got seen by more doctors in a year than I've seen in my whole life. And especially once this turned into a lawsuit, and then you get the lawsuit doctors involved, right? So the one of the best witnesses, we all liked him the most. It was actually pre-recorded testimony, but the plaintiff's witness, the expert witness we liked the best, was this doctor who really just had a great manner and a great attitude about it. And he was saying, well, look, because all this stuff happened, like there was the fire in the fire situation. Then this stuff happened in between, and then he got evaluated, and basically the doctor was like, look, he is 100% injured. He has these injuries. He's like, if you're going to convince me that he even said effectively, you could get me to the notion that these injuries were not caused by the zoo fire if you can show me what happened in between, because something happened to him. So what happened in between the zoo fire and now to cause him to sustain those injuries? And if he said, if you can do that, then maybe you'll have me. And you can even get me to switch my opinion. But here's the thing, gang. The plaintiff's attorneys did not provide any past medical history to the doctors who evaluated Stephen Lynch. They only got his medical history, his medical records from the day of the fire forward. So the thing is, if you look at his full, complete medical record, a lot of the stuff that the plaintiffs are saying happened on the day of the fire look like they happened before and were maybe exacerbated by the fire. And so when I hear the best witness for the plaintiffs say, hey, show me where this damage happened after the fire and you might have me. Well, it's like, well, I think I have it, sir. It's not that it happened after the fire. It's that a lot of it happened before the fire, or it could have. And that's the thing. None of this is clear. What, you've got the city saying, no, he was injured well before, and here's the reasons why. And you've got plaintiff's doctor saying, no, he was injured during and after, and here's the reasons why. And we, the jury, are just left to sift through that pile of evidence and try to understand who is saying the most true thing here. And in a criminal case, you're looking at, reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is not a thing in the civil case. The civil case is there a preponderance of evidence that makes you feel like what thing is more likely than not? You just need to get to 51%. What's the most likely thing that happened here, and make your decision based on that. And so, then basically, I'll get to I'll get to the deliberations very soon here. It's taken a while, but this trial took a while. So there's this long fight about exactly when and how badly Stephen Lynch was injured, right? So that's a huge whole thing that a ton of time was spent on when, if, and how he was injured, whether he's recovered, how his recovery is going, all that stuff. And then after that, it was like, okay, now we're going to do, this was a term I hadn't learned before this trial. It was economic forensics or something like that. Basically, you have experts who can say, okay, because let's say Stephen Lynch was injured because of this fire, what is the cost to him in his life in terms of his living? Because now he's got to get a different job. It's going to get paid. He's going to get paid less. So how much did this cost him? How much did the negligence cost him in income? And how much did it cost him in pain and suffering and all that stuff? And so then there's another whole long chunk, forensics accountant. Thank you. Maybe that's the exact term I was looking for. But long time of listening to forensic accountants argue over the value of this man's life in US dollars. Again, all of it hinging on the idea that we would find negligence. And here's the thing, even though I know I don't think there was negligence, I have to listen to all this, because what if A, some new piece of information comes up that does change my mind, or B, turns out I'm the only juror who thinks this, and now I've got to work with the jury on, I get overruled and they outnumber me to the point that we are going to say that there was negligence. And then I'm going to then I need to be part of the process and saying, okay, if you think he's negligent, then I'll help you figure out what this guy's life was worth. So that was the torture of being mostly sure that this information was not relevant, but not 100% sure. So I couldn't tune out. I had to pay attention. And it was so hard to just sit through literal weeks of testimony and back and forth over this situation that I think was already a no based on, it's like there was a whole iceberg of information in this case, and I was already kind of settled at the tip. We hit the tip of the iceberg, and there was already a major problem with the plaintiff's case that they never resolved. And more and more as we got through the case, I was really starting to wonder. I was feeling like I'm a pretty rational guy. I'm surrounded by, I feel, what are pretty rational jurors. We'll get to the problem juror in a second. I think that they're probably on where I'm at. And so I'm going to get to deliberations in a second here, but I'm now going to aside for the problem juror. For those of you who didn't hear the problem juror stories, we had a woman who was one of those women, or one of those people. It's not necessarily women, but just, she was a woman. But sometimes people seem a little neuroatypical. They're high functioning, but they're obviously different and very not quite self-aware of how they're being different. So or maybe inappropriately different. Anyway, so this woman, she's probably my age. I think she's in her 40s. This is not a young person. No, this is the same one rating where I'm just going to give a recap on our problem juror. problem number one was that in our jury room, she was using her phone and watching YouTube videos out loud. Like we would get these breaks all the time because the grown-ups would send us out of the room so they could fight without us, and so we're waiting in the jury chambers, and she'll bust out her phone and is like watching YouTube videos on full volume in a room full of like 12 other people. And this is early on. Nobody wants to ruffle feathers or cause conflict, so we're all kind of eye roll, like letting it go, even though it was really weird. And then I finally couldn't have it anymore because a few days into the trial, she played videos in which it was sketch comedy in which the punchlines revolved around severed limbs and orgasms. So I'm here in a jury chamber listening to crude humor about severed limbs and orgasms from a woman who's broadcast. It was just like, so I finally actually wrote to the court and said, there's a problem in our jury chambers. This juror is being inappropriate and needs to change. So then the next day, after she comes in with the bailiff, and after she spent the morning doing the thing again, and then we had a session, and then she was off talking to the bailiff while we were all waiting. She comes back into the chamber, walks over to her backpack, and in 2 seconds pulls out earbuds. Like she had the earbuds. She just wasn't even like, I couldn't even believe it, but I could, because just like, again, she just gave the vibe of neuroatypical, and I can't just expect typical behavior from this person. So, well, you could have phones. We just had strict instructions not to look up information. I mean, it doesn't matter that you have a phone. It matters that you respect don't use it for deliberation. And so maybe some places confiscate, but our court did not. Anyway, so that was only one problem with the juror. The other problem, first of all, she was falling asleep. She was like literally falling asleep in the courtroom. And at this point, we have 13 jurors and we need 12 to complete the case. So we've only got one foul to give here. One juror can be lost. And so I know the judge did not want to lose any more jurors, but this juror was falling asleep in the courtroom. It's really, mostly the judge would call for breaks when there was a clear break in the questioning, like, okay, they got through that topic. We need a break. Let's take a break here. But you always knew when the sleeper was happening, because they'd be like in the middle of a cross-examination, not at a stopping point, and you'd hear, jury, please rise. and we'd stand up. Well, 12 of us would stand up, and then we'd look and see the 13th juror still sitting in her seat, head back, eyes closed. And so she got called out. So the judge said, you told her she needed to, or told us that we needed to stay attentive. And then, so the next day, well, the juror had a solution for staying attentive and not falling asleep in the jury. She brought a hacky sack. She brought a little black and white hacky sack. And now our jury area was like the back half of this big room, and we're checkerboarded out 6 feet apart. So we're like 6 feet apart, COVID style. And she is front and center juror sitting in the front chair, and she's tossing a hacky sack repeatedly, but she's not good at it. She's tossing a hacky sack and dropping it about every third toss, and like doing these sheepish, like scooting her chair and sticking her leg out to drag the hacky sack on the floor back over to her. And it was wildly distracting. I was like, there's no way they're going to let her keep that. That is not acceptable. Sure enough, next day, hacky sack no longer part of the scenario, but she immediately started falling asleep again. And I have such empathy for her. I do. Like, she seemed like she had maybe some attention deficit. For example, I shouldn't diagnose. I should say what I saw. And like one of her behavior patterns was repeating the same motion. When she didn't have a hacky sack, she would like bang her feet against the chairs of her leg in exactly the same sequence again and again and again. So that's the kind of thing I was noticing that was like, okay, this is where she's at. But I totally get it. Like there's so much tough stuff to sit through that it was hard for me too. I mean, look, I am not diagnosed with ADHD or anything, but let me tell you, gang, one time I tried to take Adderall recreationally and I ended up doing my taxes. Okay, so probably I could use some help on that front myself, but I was having a tough time. So I totally felt her on that front. Yeah, she was sifting in her seat a lot. We all were. The seats weren't super comfortable. Anyway, they finally had to, so they cut away her hacky sack and took the hacky sack away. And then for the next 2 days, she was falling asleep again. So for like the 2 days after the hacky sack kibosh, she was nodding off again. And then the third day, the court let us know that we were down to 12 jurors. So, yes. I mean, Siriana, I have a lot of empathy for her. She was wildly inappropriate, but in a way that I did have empathy for, because I felt her on a lot of the stuff that was leading to that. Anyway, well, can you get me some, Scotty? I'll give you, I can give you my shipping address. So anyway, that's the story of our problem juror. And so back to now deliberation. So after this I got to tell you one thing before deliberation, because this was the moment, like halfway through the trial, the plaintiffs rest. They don't rest. The plaintiffs are done, right? So the plaintiffs conclude their case, but I'm like, they conclude their side of the case, and I'm all ready for the defense. I already think they failed, and I'm already for the defense, and the defense has 3 weeks to go. So the way I put it was like, I was at the point with this case halfway through where I think I could have done a reasonable job of actually doing, like, if the city's attorneys had been hit by a bus and couldn't make it, I could have been like, I got this. Put me in, coach. I can do this. I don't have a law degree, but I've got all the objections down. I know what their arguments are. Just give me who their witnesses are. I can do this. Like, effectively, I could have written their book. And the first thing they do on day one of their side is, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me introduce you to the alphabet. Let's start with the letter A. Here's how you lose. It's like, I can write the book. You don't need to tell me about the... But this is where I found the process so frustrating. But I'll get into process stuff later. Let me finish the actual deliberation. So we'll get to... I'll do a process breakdown after we actually get to the meat of how the trial resolved. So after all of this, we finally know that deliberation is close, and we're all trying to, like, none of us want to break our oaths and talk about the case before we're supposed to talk about it together, but we're all kind of wondering if we're on the same page. In other words, is this going to be a fast deliberation or slow, and all of us were kind of looking around going, I think this is going to be fast, right? Like, we're all like, and I at that point was like, I will be surprised if anybody finds their the firefighter's process to have been negligent. And if they do, I'm going to ask them what I was asking of the court and it was asking of the plaintiffs. What was the alternative? If you're going to tell me that was negligent, somebody in my jury, please tell me what the alternative was. So, and at this point, 6 weeks in, we're all pretty chummy. It's a good group. I really liked my jury. I think it was a good group of people. And yes, we had a problem juror, but of the 12 that remained, smart, dedicated, thinking people who really wanted to apply justice to this situation. It was a good group. And one of the people that I got along most with was this woman who also felt like, we got this. This is going to end quickly. No problem. Like, we've kind of like, you just got that vibe from her that she felt like it was all pretty obvious and then we would all be on the same page, right? And decide who our, what do they call it? Four-person is the new term, gender neutral term, but our judge used a different term like primary juror or something like that. In any case, we had our primary who was kind of leading the discussion, and we said, well, let's we got a lot to go into here, but let's start with kind of a straw poll. Let's just see where people are at on the first one, because we're like, hey, if we're unanimous on no negligence, then we have a 10-minute deliberation and we're done, right? We can just be done. I kind of thought that was going to happen. I was so convinced of my position and thought it was so abundantly clear that they had failed to demonstrate negligence that I thought we might be done in a handful of minutes. So we start to go around, and the head juror is just going around in order. I'm second. First person, so we give 3 categories. Was the city negligent? Yes, no, undecided. Those were the 3 choices. Juror number 1 says undecided. Okay, well, she's like, I'm mostly decided, but there's some questions I have. She says, okay, fine. I'm next. I'm second. And I go, no. And my juror friend, who clearly was thinking this was going to be over quickly, her jaw drops. She looks at me like, what? Like, she cannot believe that I have said no. And I can see that look in her eye. I'm going, okay, she disagrees with me. I guess we're not out of here in 10 seconds. But am I who knows? Maybe I'm the one, right? Like, I don't know. Well, we go to the next person. No, 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 no. All the way around the room, we get to her. She says yes. No's all the way around. And so our straw poll after the first question of negligence was 10 no's, 1 maybe, and 1 yes. Now, technically, we could have been done right then and there because the rules of, at least in our courtroom, again, I don't know how broadly these things apply outside of the situation I was in. To reach a verdict, we need 10. We need 10 of 12. So you can have 2 dissenters and still have a verdict. So in a sense, right then and there, we could have said, well, we've got it. Sorry, maybe. Sorry, yes. We've got 10 no's, no, and done. But that's not I think we would have done it. Maybe we would even waited if it was 12 just to make sure. I mean, this is a big deal. You don't want to just push something through really fast here without being really certain of where you're at. So the kind of the way we said it, though, is like, look, if there's anybody dissenting, we're going to give them to, we should talk this out tomorrow. Cause yeah, I don't know, every court movie is about the one contrary juror eventually convincing the rest of them that they're right. So we wanted to give that chance. Let's let this juror convince the rest of us she's right. It's only fair. It's only fair to all the money and time that has gone into this thing that we let all those opinions air out. So when we were not immediately unanimous, we decided to talk it out that way. And so I basically said the things I've already said to you about my opinions. And most people in the room either said those same things in their own way or agreed with the way I said it. We had a lot of agreement that basically there was no other way to fight that fire. The maybe, the person who was a maybe, her lingering doubt was, what if, because here's the thing, you only get certain information. Some questions don't get asked, some information you don't get. We didn't get specifics on how you secure utilities. Exactly what to do there was never laid out step by step. But contextually, you clearly got the clues that they needed to go in, that you had to go into the building and cut the power in the building. They're saying things like, well, you need to talk to someone on site who knows where the thing right. But this juror was like, but since they never said, here's what cutting the power meant in this situation, since they were never explicit about it, she was worried that there could have been a situation where, oh, there was that street option, right? Like you can cut the power from the pole nearby, and they could have cut power and they didn't. So she was worried. That was her lingering doubt. And it was good to bring up. I thought about that overnight and kind of pushed back on her the next day. She was saying that we had we were never told how power was cut. And next day I was like, I acknowledge that we were never told explicitly what the steps were, but we had unending contextual clues from both sides. Nobody on either side contested the constant commentary that cutting the power and securing utilities involved going into the building. And she acknowledged that. And actually, between overnight and thinking about that, she switched to a certain no. So she was certainly no. We did talk with our dissenter at length about her dissent. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, her main things were for dissent that she brought up were the lack of proper training was negligent. She still felt or said that like the failure to cut power earlier was negligent, but she never really did answer the question. And this was a big one. So this is the most interesting part of the deliberation was this third part where she said his medical care after the fact was not up to snuff. Like and I don't want to get into, again, the super details of it, but I'll say that we all basically agreed that he went to the hospital a couple of times, like figure he had a concussion and he got some checkups and stuff to see about that. But then he went to work early. He was brought back to work much earlier than you should. There was definitely an argument. There was an argument for negligence in the medical care after the fact. But here's the thing. Question number 2 is, if you found negligence, was that negligence directly responsible for the injuries sustained in the incident? You can't have treating the injuries after the fact be the cause of the injuries. So if the only way that you're fathoming that the city is negligent here is in potentially the care after the fact, he's still not going to get any money out of it. You're still going to say, yes, the city was negligent, but no, it did not cause the injuries. Therefore, case closed. So we did have a discussion about whether or not the issues we had with his care after the fact raised to the level of negligence. And again, our definition of negligence is the failure to exercise ordinary care. And that was key because even those of us who acknowledge that they should have and could have done a lot better in making sure that their compatriot was as healthy as possible and being taken care of, despite that they could have done better, it did not rise to the level of ordinary care failure. They did take him to the hospital. They insisted that he get evaluated. He was the one saying, put me back in, coach. I'm the stud NFL quarterback. I can get back in the game. And the medics on site and the caregivers on site were insisting that he be checked out. And they took him to the hospital. And that's where it's like, but he got abandoned. Like there was a situation where he got dropped off at the hospital. Did he call his wife? Did his coworkers, did his colleagues know that his wife had been called? Because he ended up, again, probably in a concussed state, like ripped his IV out of his arm and insisted he was fine and left the hospital alone with nobody and was kind of wandering around the local area. He claims he got honked at and like got nearly hit by a car, and his wife was like, "Why are you out?" And anyway, so that's like the place where we're like, okay, this should have gone better. But at the end of the day, ordinary care was still offered. I would say that staying around after dropping your coworker off at the hospital to make sure that their wife comes and gets them properly, that's extraordinary care. That's going above and beyond. The ordinary care is making sure they get to the hospital and get their care, right? So even after that discussion, we felt that the threshold of negligence was not met even in the post-injury situation. And we, as a jury, decided that to have a final vote, and if we had the 10 needed, that we were going to be done. So we went around again, and we were 11-1, and the dissenter never offered it was funny. She said, as I pushed back on her 3 elements of negligence, I pushed back on all 3 of them. Her comment was basically like, yeah, you're kind of right, but still yes, right? She just had a still yes thing. And so this was really tough. We we made our 11-1, but then we have to, we do the process. So they call back the everybody into the court, and we go in there and we do the reading, and it's all very formal. And read the, and Steve's wife, who also testified, her name was Erica. She was there the whole time. In fact, of all the jurors, I was closest to her. I was about 10 to 12 feet away from the plaintiff's wife throughout the trial. She was sitting, we were perpendicular. We weren't parallel. So she was facing one way, I was facing the other way. And so I got to see her reactions on a lot of things. And this was the toughest one, certainly, especially after all they went through. After all, think of the 4 years they've had since this incident. It was not easy. None of us in the jury room had anything but empathy and appreciation for Steve Lynch, but we could not find negligence. So we had to say that, and the judge read out in the question of, is the city of Seattle negligent? The jury finds no. And when the judge says no, Erica just burst into tears and put her head in her hands and was weeping in the courtroom. And it was really hard to know that I helped make a decision that caused that person to have that reaction. But I was doing my job and weighing the evidence and the evidence alone. And that's what got us there. And so that was very tough. Well, that's a question. We'll get to that. Let me finish. Let me completely wrap up the tale. So then we go back into our jury room, and then the judge comes to our jury room to have a conversation. The judge is looking for feedback. She was asking us how things went, and we gave her feedback. She was great, and we all thought she handled the court excellently. I think she did. And so we all liked the judge, and but then this was the interesting part. So now we have an optional phase. She comes and talks to us, and then there's two rooms. There's the door back to the courtroom and the door to leave. And she says you can leave through two doors. You can go back through the courtroom where there's going to be open discussion with the courtroom. Or if you don't want to take part in that, you feel free to leave. You're done. You've done your job here. And so they and then one juror very presciently asked, so is the plaintiff going to be in there, or is this a discussion with Steve Lynch and Erica as well? And the judge says, yes, it's an open courtroom, so Erica and Steve can stay there if they want, and I expect them to. They might be. They probably will be. And that was interesting, because a lot of jurors were like, nah, I do not wish to face the firefighter. I just said, you know what? No, we're not going to give you millions of dollars, because we could have. We had the purse strings. If we all said yes, yes, we could have said the negligence is worth millions to this guy if we wanted to. So a lot of jurors, I think they did not want to go in and look at them and have that awkwardness. And I felt it for a second, but then I was like, Ryan, stand by your work. You did your job. You should be able to talk to these people, and you should want to. I wanted to express to them how empathetic I was to the pain that they've suffered. And I wanted to explain my thought process so they at least understood how we got there. Ended up going in, and sure enough, there were two attorneys for the city and two attorneys for the plaintiff, and then of course the plaintiff and his wife. I spent most of that time talking to the plaintiff's attorneys and the plaintiff and his wife, and I'm really glad I ended up doing that because it worked both ways. Steve Lynch was kind and thoughtful and not resentful and not angry, and he was just like, I'm just glad I got my day in court. He told me, here's the things the city, the Seattle Fire Department has changed since this. So like, This legal action has produced change within the Seattle Fire Department that I feel good about, and I made them answer to their behavior. So he was feeling that way about it, and I got to and the thing that I got to explain everything I've explained to you, that fundamentally, and here's the thing, there were times when I was talking about what I believed and didn't believe about testimony. I would say, he said that, and Steve was very interactive about that. He would go, oh yeah, that guy was lying. That was he just straight up lied. So he was saying things like that about some of the testimony he witnessed. But when I said I didn't find negligence because I could not find anybody who could tell me how that fire should have been fought, and I looked Steve right in the eye and I said, Steve, I think you, in effect, were securing the utilities by doing the job to support ventilation. He did not push back an iota. He did not push back one bit when I said my issue was nobody said how the fire should have been fought. He didn't say, well, it should have been fought. So in a sense, I think I felt really good because I got to tell the guy exactly how I got there, and he didn't even push back. I think he knew that was the weakest argument they had and the biggest problem they had, and it was the problem that cost them. And it was also interesting, like but further, I said, like, they were curious what I thought of the injuries and stuff, but I kept saying, well, we didn't need to get too deep into that because we never found the negligence. But I did say to Steve and to Erica that I didn't believe that there was a single person in the jury room who thought he did not get hurt. And I also looked him in the eye and said, nobody in that jury thinks that you're a money grubber looking to grift the state. Nobody thinks that. And everybody thinks you did get hurt there. We're not in agreement on how hurt you got. But we didn't need to get into that because of ultimately not finding the negligence on how you got hurt. And the palpable relief from Erica was worth that whole interaction, because part of what was really bothering her is the idea that these people were saying that her husband's a big liar, and it meant so much to her clearly to know that the jury found Steve's story of injury to be true, and nobody found him to be deceptively trying to work the system. All of us felt like this was a guy who wanted to get back to firefighting and couldn't. So all of us got some closure there in a way that was, I think, very important, and kind of why they do that. I ended up talking to the defense attorneys a little bit. And this is where I think I blew the one of the defense attorneys' minds a little bit with this analogy, and this is another one that I gave before. As a game designer, I see systems like the court system, and my instinct is to iterate upon them, to see what's wrong with them, see what's wrong with it, and want to fix it. And what I found so frustrating was that if you were trying to achieve justice, this would never be how you would do it. And here was my analogy. It's the one I came up with when I was talking to my mom. My mom is a retired teacher, so she is an educator. And I said, Mom, here's an analogy for you for how weird this whole system and process is. All right, imagine, Mom, you're teaching a class of 12 people. And those 12 students, 10 of them, they have to get a B+ or better. If you can't get 10 of those students to a B+ or better, you have failed your job at this class. It was not a successful class. So, but there are some rules to your teaching. You do not get to test your students. You do not get to have a conversation with your students. You do not get to do any investigation into what your students are thinking, what things they're understanding or what they're not understanding. Very occasionally, a student will get to send you a question, and that's how you're going to do it. You have to teach them that way. But it's tougher. You don't get to just make presentations to your class. You don't get to lecture and say, here's the stuff I want you to hear. The only way you're allowed to teach the class is by bringing subject matter experts in and doing question and answer with them. That's how and they don't get to lecture either. It has to be a series of relatively short back and forth question and answer questions. And that's how you have to teach this class. I'm like, Mom, how would you do that? And she's like, well, once you realize that that's what's being asked of attorneys, you understand how burdened the system is. Because if they can't know what we're thinking, they have to presume the worst. They have to presume that I'm still a D student, that I don't understand anything that's going on. They got to repeat lessons again and again and again and just hope that it's sinking in. And I just don't understand it, especially because here's the thing. I said questions get through a little bit here and there. I think this is a fairly local thing. I don't know how widespread it is, but for civil cases like we were in, the jury, after all the attorneys were done with any given witness, the jurors got to write questions that we want answered. Like, I want to ask a follow-up question. However, like, court is all about tight control over communication. One of the weirdest parts was like watching an attorney try to ask a question in the right way. And it's like, nope, you asked it wrong. Objection, objection, objection. And they ask a question in 5 different ways. And finally on the 5th one, the objection is overruled. Like 4 sustained objections followed by an overruled objection, you may answer. Whereas the answer they give would have been the same if they had answered the first question or the 5th question, but the nature of the court is, nope, you got to communicate exactly perfectly. And so we were allowed to ask questions of any given witness, but the judge held our questions to the same scrutiny that the attorneys held each other's questions. So effectively, if there was a sustainable objection to your question, it wouldn't be read, which was really interesting. I had to get good at what court found objectionable so I could ask questions that would even be asked. And what I wasn't sure about this process was how it played out, because how it played out for me was this. I got a piece of paper. I wrote my questions down. They have the jury leave. We're waiting. Then they call us back in. We sit down, and then the judge reads out whatever questions they found to be acceptable, right? So what I didn't understand was, does the rest of the court see all of this, or is the court only hearing the questions that the judge determines to read? Because here was my classic gamer, min-maxing game designer here. I wanted to game the system. I wanted so badly to communicate with these attorneys. As a student being taught by these attorneys, I wanted to communicate with my teachers about how the lesson was going. Especially again in that early case where I desperately wanted to tell those plaintiffs' attorneys that their case was sunk with me unless they addressed this key issue. And so I considered this and decided not to, because I didn't know how the system worked and because I didn't want to do anything risking like a mistrial or something. I didn't do this, but I seriously considered asking a question of a firefighter like this, saying, another firefighter comes on the stand. I wanted to write a question saying, because the plaintiff's attorneys have utterly failed to demonstrate negligence in the fighting of this fire, comma, can you offer an alternative to the way the fire was fought? Right? Why can't, but I didn't do that because I didn't want to risk mucking up an already obviously massively expensive court process because I'm some clever system gamer, right? I wasn't going to kind of like cleverly game the system that way in something as serious as we were in. So I didn't walk that line. But then I did find out after that, sure enough, everybody in the courtroom sees everything on that page from every juror. And it's been happening in the court system, in our court system for like 20 years, I guess. And, when I told the defense attorney my teaching analogy, she was like, wow, I've been having these discussions with jurors for like 20 years now, and nobody's ever framed it that way, and it's spot on. That's great. She's like, well, what would you do to solve it? And I was like, well, completely overhaul the U.S. justice system? That doesn't seem realistic, but as I think about it now, and actually, let's see, I got to look at a time. It's 1:30. In a half an hour, I'm going to actually have a follow-up Zoom meeting with the defense attorneys, because our conversation got cut off. The judge came back in and the jurors had to leave before I was done talking about, talking to these defense attorneys. And they wanted to talk to me more. So I'm going to talk to them in about a half hour. And I think, Vanessa is the attorney I talked to most, and she was asking me for like, well, how would you change the system? And I didn't have a good answer at the time yesterday, but I actually have a pretty good answer now because there's precedence. The system is already gameable. I, as a juror member, could directly communicate instead of a question for the jury. I could write a journal entry to the attorneys, put a question mark on the end, and call that my question, and they would see it. So there's already a means for the jury to communicate directly with the attorneys in these civil cases anyway. I would suggest that the whole system, instead of making it a system gaming thing to do what I'm talking about, they should embrace it, since it's already legally possible for me to do that anyway. Since I could game the system and communicate directly with the attorneys anyway, why not just encourage it? Why not encourage daily journals? Let the attorneys have a multiple choice test that they give you every day. How are you feeling about, if you had to rule right now, how would you rule on negligence? Why do you think yes or no? Right? Like, I just feel like if juries were allowed to communicate directly how they were feeling about things directly to the attorneys involved, it would change everything for the better, in the same way that students communicating with a teacher is essential to their learning. So I don't know, maybe we'll change. Maybe this is ground zero for changing the legal system for the better, but probably not. But I would say that to anybody out there who has any influence over the justice system, that is my number one piece of feedback. The whole thing would be so much better and streamlined and efficient if the attorneys were given greater access to what's actually going on in the juror brains. Potentially, but Fluffy says, I'm a person of intelligence. The bar for average human is low, and lines of direct communication would lead to more people getting gamed by attorneys. I don't know about that. I think if you had, if both sides agreed on a questionnaire or whatever, you could absolutely extract, and by doing it in a test form that's you don't need hyper intelligence. You just need to be able to say where you're at. I don't know. We'll see. But the other part of that whole equation, to take the teaching analogy further, is that students do homework together to be successful. We sit down and we talk about stuff together as students to better learn the material. I know this will never happen because they want the whole purity, like you should get all the information and decide, and then and then get together. But personally, I think, hey, you've established your jury of 12 people. Let them start talking immediately. Let them come in after the day's events and start hashing out what they heard and didn't hear. On the one hand, I don't think this will ever happen because they don't want jurors to poison each other's minds, so to speak. But I don't see it that way. I think I see it as jurors helping each other understand the context. And I think that that if we had been allowed to talk to each other the whole way through, it would have been a better experience as well. That I have far less hope on, but I think it would be beneficial as well. Another final thought is, I don't know. Somebody said that this was likely decimating. This could be financially ruinous to Steve and Erica to go through this obviously wildly expensive litigation and not get awarded anything at the end. The thing is, I don't know who paid for it. I might ask the city attorneys this when I talk to them in a bit, because I don't know how personal injury lawyering works. Maybe some of you out there know, but my presumption is that personal injury lawyers as a company or as a business are like poker players placing bets. And I would be surprised if Steve Lynch and his wife paid for a ton of this. I would expect that it was mostly paid for by the plaintiff's attorneys who were putting a bet on this case that would pay off if a big settlement came in, right? Yeah, I assumed it was no win, no fee, and that the burden of the gamble, so to speak, was on the plaintiff's attorneys and not on the plaintiff. But who knows? And then also the other thing, though, was, look, if Steve and Erica decided to place their bet, if they did pay for this whole thing and it has decimated them, I'm sorry, but that's another life choice they made. They made a choice to take this chance, and I can't rule as a juror based on whether or not I would like Steve and Erica to live a wonderful, happy life for the rest of their life. I have to rule based on the evidence put before me, which is what we did. But speaking of the cost of it, the other big takeaway I had for the whole legal process here is that justice is for the rich. Justice is for the rich. And it's kind of sad. I don't know what to do about that either. But if you have some complaint, you generally can't quite bring it unless you've got the pockets. So that's maybe the thing that depressed me most, is that how much the whole proceedings cost and how average people just don't have access to even pursue that kind of justice in their lives. So, yeah, I think mostly you get settlements, and that's the thing I was wondering. Like, I had wondered, like, if all 11 of us jurors who were pretty early, who were convinced of the no, were able to communicate that no to the plaintiff's attorneys, would they have just cut a deal much sooner? True says, been of the opinion that private practice lawyers never should have happened. That's interesting. Just make the whole thing, this is a state system. So that's a thought exercise for another day for sure. But fundamentally, I think I've laid out the major takeaways and major learnings from that whole thing. Before I wrap up, any AMAs? I mean, I know I went on a long time there, but if anybody's got questions for me, I'm happy to take them. I'll give it a second here. What else? We got, I had to travel to the east side across a toll bridge to get to the court. They did not reimburse me for tolls. I got a $5 stipend, a $5 gift card for the local for the coffee cart. That was my pay. Am I keeping in touch with any of my fellow jurors? I meant to get the contact info for one of the jurors who was looking for an old Magic booster pack that they'd had for a decade plus that he couldn't remember what set it was. I'm like, well, it could be anything from a $50,000 pack to a $2 pack. I don't know. But if you want to tell me if you want to find it and let me know, I'll tell you what you got. So I was going to get his info so he could find it and show me, but I never got that from him. Well, become a city attorney on one of the case I'm a jury on there. I'm on the jury of Fluffy. So what else is there? Right. Well, that's my feeling, but because surely the defense has no reason to settle then, right? But they might settle. It depends on how low you go. If you're like, look, we're not going to win this. We could save you all, $30,000 in future appearance fees. Can we settle this for 20? Maybe. I don't know. But I also had the wondering of, like, let's say we implemented my solutions to make things more efficient, and suddenly these civil cases that were taking 6 weeks to resolve were now largely being resolved in a matter of like a week. Would that just increase the frequency with which personal injury attorneys would place those bets? Does it actually and have a downside in reducing friction in the system, encouraging people to be more frivolous with what they bring to court. I don't know. I did think about that, but I don't think you can worry about that. I think you gotta make the system as efficient as possible, and then worry about solving the problem of frivolous lawsuits, and solve that maybe with, like, if your lawsuit gets thrown out as frivolous, you take on a significant penalty or something like that. But I am actually going to be meeting the city attorneys for further discussion in about 15 minutes. So I should probably wrap this up anyway and decompress a little bit. But actually, it was really nice to have this talk before heading back into the talk with them, because it helped frame my thoughts on this some more. And yeah, the city definitely had to pay for its own defense in that way. Yeah. What do you mean frivolous lawsuits just don't happen? Surely, I mean, did you see the election? I can name 50-something frivolous lawsuits that related to the election fraud. How about that? I can't tell if you mean, like, well, the whole idea of a small guy suing big guys frivolously, I mean, that's my whole point. Justice is for the rich. The small guy can't. But are there frivolous lawsuits? Oh, yes, there are. Come on. Yeah. I think, yes, bringing this frivolously is an extreme risk. I mean, it's just too, like, why would you do it? It seems like a bad bet. To take the poker analogy, a frivolous lawsuit is the equivalent of shoving all in with your 7 deuce and hoping they fold, you know? Just at work, yeah. No, yeah, I'm going to use this backdrop. Whatever. They'll ask about it, and I'll tell them that they know what your job is. They know I'm a streamer, game designer. So I'll just tell them this is my stream background. No problem. Anyway, I really should wrap up, and now I'm just kind of trailing away here when the meat of the topic is done. So you made it all the way to the end of my courtroom spiel. I hope those of you who did found this somewhat interesting. Again, it was tough to live through minute by minute, but I have no regrets. It was a fascinating process. I'm happy to have done my civic duty in this regard and have interesting stories to tell and a thoughtful experience to dwell on. So thank you for hearing me out on it, and I will see you next Monday, 9 a.m. Seattle time. Oh my God, gang. We're back to normal. Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific, starting on Monday. We'll see you then.